So I just want to start by welcoming you to the very first Who's Who in American History. This is a program that I was kind of excited about, and we thought we'd kind of tie it in with our summer reading program. But first, to tell you a little bit about who I am. Since I'm going to be telling you history, maybe you should know a little bit about me. Of course, my name is Denise. You probably know that. And I have another job in addition to this library job, and that is I teach at Fresno State University. I teach U.S. history. And so some of what I'm going to share with you is stuff that I've pulled from other classes that I've taught. And I've tried to pull out some people that I've talked about in class that have made a difference in history. And the purpose of this is to show people that even one person can make a difference, and often do. And so we're going to start pretty early in American history with actually before us being America, and we're going to look at some founding fathers, and that is our theme today, is founding fathers. And I'm going to talk very briefly. Yeah, you looked at the book, so I could tell that you knew who we were going to talk about. I might have to hide the books next time. And so I want to talk about 3 founding fathers. Now, there was a lot of founding fathers that had, and even some founding mothers that haven't made history quite as much. But the 3 that I want to talk about today are ones that I think had an interesting impact and might be interesting to talk about. And so that's what we're going to do today. Our very first founding father that made a difference in history is Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was born in the West Indies, and as a 11-year-old boy, he was hired as a clerk. And that's the first thing that stands out in my mind. At 11 years old, he's working. And he was recognized by the people he worked for as being smart, and so the locals raised money to send him to school in New York. And they were probably hoping that he would then come back and use his knowledge in their hometown. However, he stayed. And a couple things that Hamilton did that was significant in regards to the Revolutionary War. Now, remember, in the time that he is in America and making his impacts is when we're beginning to get really upset with Great Britain. We're not liking the way we're being treated. They're treating us like second-class citizens, not as equals. And a couple things that he did is supported the trade embargo in order to show our displeasure. We're just not going to buy your goods. He also served in the Revolutionary War. He was in 2 of the major battles that helped with the war, and that's the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And the Battle of Trenton and Princeton are some of the first success stories in the Revolutionary War. He also served under Washington as an aide-de-camp, and then he was given the field command at the Battle of Yorktown. He was an ordinary person, not somebody of fame and fortune, and he thought that the getting a battle command would help bring up his status. And so he was given the Battle of Yorktown field command. And so, as we know, the Battle of Yorktown is the beginning of the end of the Revolutionary War, but it didn't settle the Americas, because now we have to figure out how to become a country. And so now, at this stage in history, we're going to begin so we have to figure out our government. And so they're going to meet and write the Constitution. And Hamilton, of course, was a part of that. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and he favored a strong federal government. And this was going to be the very first political factions in our country's history. Do we want the states to maintain bigger control, or do we want the federal government? And Hamilton supported a strong federal government. He thought with a strong federal government we would have a better chance of showing our strength to the outside world. And he also played a role in the ratification of the Constitution. He published 51 of the 85 essays that are called the Federalist Papers. And he served as a first Secretary of Treasury, setting up some of the America's financial institutions that helped us become a nation, the national banking system. And one of the other things he did that was significant is that he had the federal government assume the state debt, the debt that was occurred because of the Revolutionary War. The disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson are really what's going to become this two-party system that I mentioned earlier. Jefferson argued that if a government had too much power, Jefferson argued that if we had a strong central government, it would be like a monarchy, which is what they just had fought a war to avoid. Hamilton argued that our new government wouldn't survive without a strong government. And so this is kind of the beginnings of our two-party system. Okay, and so how did those contributions change history? Because that's the whole point of this is, what does one person do that changed history? Well, his contributions helped us separate from Great Britain. We're not British today. We are Americans. And the Constitution that he was instrumental in and instrumental in getting it ratified, we're still using that same Constitution today. And so that's a significant contribution. And we do have a strong central government that he was proposed for, rather than the states being over the central government. So that's Alexander Hamilton. At the end, I'm going to introduce three men to you, and at the end we'll discuss these differences and see what we think. We'll have time to talk about that. The next one I want to talk about is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was English born. He immigrated to the colonies in 1774, and so he was here when we started the Revolutionary War. He was a philosopher and a writer. Some of his major contributions, and there's two of them, and I have a handout over there that you can take that has one of his writings. He published the Common Sense. Common Sense sold 150,000 copies. Now, at this time period, with movable type and print media, print was more readily available, and so that many copies, even though there was a lot of copies out, there's an assumption that every one of those copies was shared by several neighbors, and so we don't know how many people actually read it. We only know how many copies they printed. In it, he argued for representational government. That doesn't sound like anything amazing today, but you have to keep in mind at the time, many people thought that a government couldn't withstand without a monarch. How do you maintain a country without a king or a queen? And so this was mind-blowing to think that we can survive without a king. And so this pamphlet that he published talks about that. And not only did he say we can do it, but he said it's our natural right to be self-ruled, rather than having somebody who was born into it just because of where they were born, that they're going to tell us that they're the ruler. So another thing that happened during the Revolutionary War that he was significant at is during Valley Forge. It was a winter camp, not a battle, but a lot of people died there because of the conditions. The food wasn't, the logistics weren't getting to them. They were cold, they didn't have good enough shelter, the water was contaminated because of where they located the bathrooms, and people were dying of diseases and frostbite. They didn't have enough blankets, they didn't have enough shoes, and so he saw that it was causing morale to go down. And so he went out and he wrote The American Crisis. And I'm going to read an excerpt from that because his writing helped keep people from going AWOL. People thought, I'm going to die if I stay here, I'm going home. And so he wrote this to help encourage people, make them realize what they were doing really mattered. And this is what it's, in part, what it says. These are the times that try men's souls, and I'm sure you've heard that before. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of this country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods. Anyways, he goes on. And so he's trying to tell the men that, yeah, this is difficult, but that's just going to make the end result that much more glorious. And so it works, along with some changing of the way Valley Forge is run. They move the bathrooms away from the water source and such. So, so the things I want us to talk about is, how did Thomas Paine's contribution change history at all? And what did he do? And one, his pamphlet, Common Sense, encouraged some people to realize, yeah, we can break from Britain. We don't need a king necessarily. We can rule ourselves, and perhaps even should rule ourselves. He taught people that a country could run without a monarch, and he helped motivate soldiers at Valley Forge in a very trying time that I can't even imagine what it would be like. All right, the last person I want to talk about, and I am moving quickly because I want to give us enough time for discussion at the end, is Benjamin Franklin. And when I thought up this Who's Who in American History series, my first thought was talk about one person each week. And this was going to be this week's, Benjamin Franklin. But then I thought, you know, that's pretty single-sided, because we can't say one person's contributions is what saved the revolution. You know, there was more people involved. And so I tried to pick people from different areas in history. But Benjamin Franklin is fascinating to me, and so I really wanted to talk about him. He was born of a modest family. His father was a soap and candle maker. And a father of 17 children, not Benjamin Franklin, but he was one of 17. That's a lot of kids. And education at this time wasn't free. And if you had 17 children to try to educate, you're going to have to pick and choose who gets to go to school. In fact, Benjamin Franklin's father wanted to send Benjamin Franklin to a seminary, but he couldn't afford it. And so Benjamin Franklin had very little formal education. At age 12, he was apprenticed out to his brother, one of his many brothers, to be a printer. His brother ran a print shop. And so he worked along with his brother. And they didn't get along real well. But Benjamin Franklin, he asked if he could write for the paper, and of course the brother said, no, you're just a kid, just, you know, set the type and run the printer press. And so Benjamin Franklin started secretly writing a letter to the editor and slipped it under the door. And the writing was so good that it got printed in the paper. And Benjamin Franklin signed the name.
Richard.
No, that was later.
Oh, it was later.
No, this is Silence Dogood. Have you heard of her? Yeah, Silence Dogood. And so it was a lady, and he wrote these letters, and in that handout that I have for you later on, there's some of what he wrote as Silence Dogood. And everybody wanted to know who this woman was. He was a widow, and she was talking about, you know, proper behavior and things like that. And so when the brother found out that it was Benjamin, and everyone else all impressed with Benjamin's writings, their relationship got even worse. And so Benjamin Franklin said, all right, I'm out of here. And even though he's in contract to stay there, he ran away, which is illegal. So he left and went to Philadelphia at age 17, and he found work in another print shop. That's what his experience was. And was received so well there that somebody agreed to put him up his own business and sent him to London to get trained. But the deal fell through. And so that didn't happen. So he ended up in London having to work enough to get enough money to come back to America, which he did. And when he came home, he opened his own shop. He published the Pennsylvania Gazette, and as you made mention of, Poor Richard's Almanac, which is where we get a lot of little cute sayings like, a stitch in time saves 9, fish and guests are alike, they both start to stink in 3 days, you know, things like that. And so that comes from Poor Richard's Almanac. He married Deborah Reed. It's a girl that he had met prior to going to London, And when he came back, she was already married, but her husband had moved on, left her. And so she assumed that that was a divorce, so they married. And at this point, history doesn't know. I was going to say nobody knows, but somebody knows. History doesn't know who's the mother, but Benjamin Franklin had a son. And he brought that son into the marriage with Deborah, and she raised it like it was her own. And then they had other children as well. 3 more children. One died at a young age, so only 2 made it to adulthood, in addition to William, the one that is not Deborah's. An interesting side note, and I'm trying not to get off topic too much, William, when the Revolutionary happened, is an adult man, and he stays loyal to the crown. And Benjamin, of course, is a part of the Revolution and the new country. And so the father and son never talked again. Kind of a sad split. You know, the split of nations did split families as well. Okay. So that's a little bit about Benjamin Franklin, and I'm going to talk about some of his contributions because it tells a little bit more about, in addition to his print shop and his publications, the Pennsylvania Gazette, the Farmer's Almanac, he had other contributions. And what I find fascinating about Benjamin Franklin, with no education, or little education, he has, any one of these items I'm about to tell you about is enough for one accomplishment for a lifetime. But many of these he's attributed to doing. So one of them is inventions. One thing he invented was a stove. Basic metal box that you put the fire in. Because at this time, women cooked on an open fireplace that was so big they'd have to kind of crawl into it to move the coals around. And because women wore long skirts at the time, household accidents with fire was very common. And so this stove that you can put a pot on the top of and the fire inside made it much more safe. He also invented bifocals. I pointed to mine as if I'm wearing bifocals. No, mine are trifocals. But he got tired of taking his glasses off to read and putting them on to see distance, and so he invented bifocals, which is a technology that is still used significantly today. And then the other one is a lightning rod. And if you've ever built a house, you know that you have to tie all the electric lines to the ground, so if lightning hits a house, it travels around the house instead of on it. And so this is something that he is attributed to as well. And he believed in many of these cases that he didn't, this is important enough that I should share it with everyone, so he didn't hold a patent, and he shared that knowledge with everybody. In fact, we're going to talk about him going to France in a minute. He actually took that knowledge of how to add a lightning rod to houses with him to France. Okay, so we already mentioned he was a printer. Let's talk about his accomplishments. We talked about this silence do good, but the thing with the printers and getting material out is significant because this is a time where you can't just pick up your phone and look at news. You don't get a daily TV news. And so by getting these newspapers printed, and then he started sending his newspapers to all the colonies, not just the one he worked at. And so that is a significant change, is getting more readership. The other thing that he's attributed with, and I probably should have started with this one just because of where we're sitting, is the very first library in the colonies was with Benjamin Franklin. And this is as a young man, before his first trip to London. He had a friend that had books in his home, and Benjamin would borrow them, and he wouldn't just read the book, he would study it and devour it, and then he'd return it and borrow another one. And he realized that knowledge found in books was not available equally to everybody. And he thought it should be. And so he formed a book club called the Junto Club. Junto's means a political group or faction. And they would, they borrowed books from people, and people would loan them books, and they set up their own library. And at first it was only open to them, but then they allowed other people to come in and borrow these books. So they got books donated, and started having the community borrow and read these books. So the very first library, and for the same reasons that libraries operate today, is to give access to materials, and now it's also digital materials and computer access to people that for the whole community. He also served as a Postmaster General, and while he was Postmaster General, he did things like sped up the delivery time. Oh, I thought that was my phone. I was going to be embarrassed. He sped up the delivery time of mail. For example, it took more than 2 months for mail to get to the colonies, and that was from England, Great Britain. There was no mail delivery system for a long time in the colonies, from colony to colony. The mail that you delivered was back and forth to Great Britain and the colony. And so with Benjamin Franklin as Postmaster General, he set up regular schedules, and he had his riders change horses and stop over. So he set these schedules, the horses would get changed out, the riders would then, a fresh rider would get the mail and keep going and ride through the night. And he fixed it so that, like for example, from Philadelphia to New York, a letter would get there in 24 hours. So a big difference. And of course, this is going to be significant because if the colonies can't communicate between each other, we can't organize a revolution, right? If we can only talk to Great Britain. So that's significant. He also served as a minister to France from 1776 to 1778. And while he was there, he was very popular. And he sought French support for our revolution. Highly respected. Thomas Jefferson actually succeeded him as minister. And when somebody said, oh, it is you who will replace Franklin, Jefferson replied, no one can replace him. Sir, I am only his successor. And so even Jefferson knew that Benjamin Franklin was just wildly popular in France. So he also served in the Constitutional Convention in 1789. He was the oldest delegate there, and of course supported the passing of the Constitution. And so pretty significant in that. And I probably should have mentioned and put in my notes here somewhere that he's actually one of the only people on a dollar bill that's not a president, on a paper dollar. So, I don't know, maybe that's not important. So how did these contributions change history? Well, the inventions like the stove and the lightning rod, less accidents, bifocals helped more people be able to see, doing multiple tasks. He brought more printed matter to the colonies with his print shops, allowed publication of pamphlets that spread the word about independence. This idea of a library being needed for all people is still part of our library's mission statement today. His Postmaster General, his quickening that route between the colonies was extremely significant in setting up communication between colonies. They set up what they called letters of correspondence, so the colonies could compare what was going on in each colony and share notes. Without France, we would not have been able to win the Revolutionary War. We were a very young nation, very inexperienced, and so bringing France on. And France was just kind of waiting to make sure we were on the winning side before they were willing to join us. And so that was significant. They had a navy and they could prevent they could help us on two sides. So anyways, and the Constitutional Convention that he was at, well, we have a constitutional government today and a constitution that still is, and I think this is brilliant because most constitutions of nations have been scrapped and started over. State constitutions, whatever. But the men at this, and it was men, just because of the day that it was, realized that times are going to change, and they wrote a constitution that could be amended, which it has been. I don't know the exact number offhand, and that it could be interpreted and changed as time changes. And so it is an amazing document in and of itself. And so I want us to discuss these three men, but broadly speaking, all three of these men were around during the Constitution.